Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the most important political leaders in Indian history. He was the first Prime Minister of independent India, holding strong political beliefs. His legacy still lives on in the Indian political system today. Nehru was born into a wealthy family on November 14, 1889 in Allahabad, India. Jawahar's father, Motilal Nehru, was a lawyer with strong Western political beliefs, which he later passed on to Nehru. He had a privileged European lifestyle that most kids could only dream of. He continued his education in England at Harrow and then Trinity College at Cambridge. He later studied law at the Inner Temple in London. 4 years later, Nehru married Kamala Kaul. Their only child, Indira Priyadarshini, was born in 1917. On April 13, 1919, British troops opened fire on thousands of unarmed Indians who had been protesting the recently passed legislation that permitted the detainment of suspected political foes without trial. This became known as the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. 379 Indians were killed and more than 1,000 were wounded. When hearing that the British military stationed there continuously fired for 10 minutes on a crowd of unarmed citizens, Nehru became even more determined to gain independence from Britain. This altered the course of his life. In 1919, Nehru joined the Indian National Congress, one of India's two major political parties. The leader of the party, Mahatma Gandhi, greatly influenced Nehru. Gandhi's determination to bring change in self-government from the British sparked Nehru's interest the most. The British did not appreciate the Indian people's efforts to gain freedom through the non-cooperation movement. They went ahead and banned the operation of the Indian Congress parties. Nehru was then arrested for the very first time for acting against the British government's rule. He ended up having to spend a total of 9 years in jail, during which he wrote many letters to his daughter, Indira. In 1942, Indian Congress leaders launched the Quit India movement in response to Britain's declaration of India's participation in the war against Germany. Due to the lack of consultation regarding the matter, Indian leaders passed the Quit India resolution on August 8, 1942. Nehru said, "India can take the full share of responsibility of fighting against fascism if immediate independence is granted." This demanded political freedom in exchange for India's participation in the war. In response to this movement, the British arrested all Congress leaders, including Nehru. On May 21, 1947, Winston Churchill handwrote a letter to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Clement Attlee, agreeing to support Indian independence. In his letter, he said, "My dear Prime Minister, I have now had the opportunity of consulting my colleagues upon the terms of a possible settlement in India, which you and the Viceroy put before us last night. As a result, I am in a position to assure you that if those terms are made good, so that there is an effective acceptance of dominion status for the several parts of a divided India, the Conservative Party will agree to facilitate the passage this session of the legislation necessary to confer dominion status upon such several parts of India. Believe me, yours sincerely, Winston Churchill." In 1947, the last British Viceroy, Louis Mountbatten, finalized the British roadmap for withdrawal from India. In the meantime, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, had come to dominate Muslim politics in India. Negotiation talks about the sharing of power between Nehru and Jinnah failed, causing the partition of India. On August 15, 1947, India finally gained its independence, and Nehru became the nation's first prime minister. On this day, he delivered one of the greatest speeches of all time, Tryst with Destiny, which focuses on the series of events which led up to the independence of India.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Amid the celebration of newly acquired freedom, there was also considerable turmoil. The mass displacement that followed the partition into the separate nations of India and Pakistan, and disputes over the control of Kashmir, resulted in the loss of property and life. A telegram concerning the violent events occurring during the partition was sent from the High Commissioner for the United Kingdom to a Commonwealth Relations Officer on September 15, 1947. The world's biggest migration of human beings took place during the partition of India and Pakistan. 15 million people crossed boundaries. Millions of people lost their homes and became refugees. Religious riots began, slaughtering almost 5 million people. In addition, over 83,000 women were abducted on both the Hindu and Muslim side. After these chaotic events, Nehru returned his focus to India. He began to build India up for success. He's quite often recalled as the architect of modern India. He helped create the framework of the Indian Constitution, which includes parliamentary rights, duties of citizens, fundamental rights, and federal union of states. He also introduced the 5-year plan in 1951, which focused on the stimulation of economic growth and development. It focused on improving science and technology, irrigation and energy, agriculture and community development, transport and communications, industry, social services, and land rehabilitation. In the late 1940s, both the Soviet Union and the US sought India to be an ally in the Cold War. Nehru did not want to join either side, so he professed neutrality. This was his famous non-alignment movement, which he co-founded with other international leaders. This made it so that countries that did not want to take sides in a dispute would not need to. The Sino-Indian War, or the Sino-Indian border conflict, was a dispute between China and India that occurred in 1962. An argued Himalayan border was the main catalyst for war. On November 20th, 1962, China declared a ceasefire, ending the month-long war. China ended up winning and retaining control of the region. Nehru was bombarded with criticism back at home for the use of his pacifism in response to China's hostility, as well as the lack of preparation and supplies for the war. On the morning of May 27, 1964, Nehru, at age 74, suffered from a sudden heart attack. He died later that day in a coma. The very next day, his funeral procession commenced from the Teen Murti house and ended at River Yamuna. An estimated 3 million people lined the route to pay their respects to their first prime minister. Nehru was cremated on the bank of the River Yamuna. Many world leaders showed up to pay their respects. This included the British Prime Minister, a Sri Lankan politician, the US Secretary of State, and the Soviet Vice Premier. India mourned over their leader's death for 12 days.
If I were to describe my father, I would say that he was the humanity in a human being. That he looked at all problems. He was deeply interested in all problems, anything that had to do with men and women and children. But he saw them always in a much larger context, in the context of the nation, and the nation in the context of the world.
Nehru established 4 pillars of domestic policy which formed a strong base for the Indian government. The pillars are democracy, secularism, non-alignment, and socialism. In the words of Jawaharlal Nehru, failure comes only when we forget our ideals and objectives and principles.